approximately 10 a.m. On January 15th, 1947, the Los Angeles Police Department received a notification regarding a discovery in the Leimert Park district. The initial observation was made by a local resident, Betty Bersinger, who was walking south on Norton Avenue, accompanied by her 3-year-old daughter. They were en route to a shoe repair shop. As they passed an undeveloped lot on the west side of the street, located between 39th Street and Coliseum Street, Bersinger noticed a pale figure situated in the wild grasses and weeds, approximately 6 inches from the sidewalk. Perception played a significant role in the initial delay of the report. According to her statement, Bersinger first believed the figure to be a discarded store mannequin due to the stark whiteness of the skin and the unnatural positioning. It was only upon closer visual inspection that the nature of the discovery became apparent. Bersinger immediately obstructed her daughter's view and rushed to a nearby residence to contact the authorities. The first patrol officers to arrive at the location were identified in records as Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald. They approached the scene between 10:15 and 10:30 a.m. Their initial notes describe the environmental conditions as cool and overcast, with the ground remaining damp from the morning dew. Upon entering the perimeter, the officers confirmed that the subject was a human female. The condition of the individual was anomalous and presented an immediate procedural challenge. The subject had been separated into 2 distinct sections at the waistline, a procedure medically referred to as a hemicorpectomy. The lower portion of the subject was positioned a short distance from the upper torso. Investigators noted that the positioning appeared deliberate rather than haphazard. The arms were raised above the shoulders and bent at right angles. A critical forensic observation made by officers Perkins and Fitzgerald, and later corroborated by detectives, was the almost total absence of biological fluids on the ground surrounding the subject. Despite the severe nature of the separation, the soil beneath the individual was dry. This detail led investigators to an immediate and definitive conclusion. The vacant lot on Norton Avenue was a secondary location. The fatal incident had occurred elsewhere, and the individual had been transported and deposited at this site after the fact. Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown took charge of the scene shortly after 11 a.m. Their procedural focus was on the immediate environment. They searched for tire tracks, footprints, or any indication of how the subject was conveyed to the lot. According to case files, faint tire tracks were observed near the curb, but the pavement was dry and the impressions were indistinct. A cement sack containing watery blood was located nearby and collected as potential evidence. However, the integrity of the location was rapidly compromised. In 1947, the procedural boundaries between law enforcement and the press were porous. Reporters and photographers from the Los Angeles Examiner and other publications arrived almost simultaneously with the detectives, monitoring police radio frequencies. Records indicate that press members and onlookers walked through the vacant lot, potentially trampling forensic indicators in their attempts to secure photographs. This failure to secure the perimeter resulted in the permanent loss of potential trace evidence, such as footwear impressions or tire treads that might have identified a vehicle. The examination of the subject at the scene revealed further procedural complexities. The individual had sustained significant trauma to the face, specifically lacerations extending from the corners of the mouth toward the ears. Despite the severity of these injuries, the clinical notes emphasize the lack of fluid at the scene, reinforcing the theory that the individual had been thoroughly cleaned prior to being placed in the lot. The precision of the separation at the waist suggested to investigators that the person responsible possessed some degree of anatomical knowledge or skill. At this stage, the identity of the individual was unknown. There was no identification found at the location. No purse, clothing, or personal effects were present. The subject was entirely unclothed. The only potential identifier was the physical description: a female with dark hair, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, with blue eyes. The priority for detectives, Hansen and Brown, shifted to identification. Without a name, the investigation could not proceed to background checks or timeline reconstruction. The subject was transported to the Los Angeles County morgue, where the medical examiner began a more detailed assessment. The official autopsy report, conducted by Dr. Frederick Newbar, listed the cause of the loss of life as hemorrhage and shock due to concussion of the brain and lacerations of the face. The report noted that the separation of the body occurred after the fatal event. To expedite identification, the Los Angeles Police Department utilized a technology that was cutting edge for the era: the sound photo machine. This device allowed for the transmission of images over telephone lines. In a procedural decision that blurred the lines between investigation and media relations, the police accepted assistance from the Los Angeles Examiner. The newspaper possessed the necessary equipment to transmit the subject's fingerprints to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. The prints were scanned and transmitted. The Bureau's Identification Division processed the request rapidly. The search of the database yielded a match due to a prior interaction the individual had with law enforcement, as well as an employment application. The subject was identified as Elizabeth Short, 22 years of age. According to federal records, Short's fingerprints were on file from a 1943 arrest in Santa Barbara for underage drinking. She had also worked briefly as a clerk at the Camp Cook Commissary, a position which required fingerprinting. With a positive identification secured, the investigation pivoted from a John Doe procedural to a focused background analysis. However, the media involvement that aided the identification soon caused significant ethical and procedural damage. Reporters from the Examiner utilized the identification to contact Elizabeth Short's mother, Phoebe Short, in Massachusetts. In a deceptive maneuver documented in journalism history, they informed Phoebe that her daughter had won a beauty contest. It was only after extracting background information about Elizabeth's life and habits that they revealed the truth of the death. This breach of ethics not only caused unnecessary distress, but also alerted potential suspects that the identity was known. Back in Los Angeles, investigators began reconstructing Elizabeth Short's timeline. It became evident that she was a transient figure in the city, moving frequently between hotels, rooming houses, and private residences. The police file indicates she had no permanent address at the time of the incident. This lack of stability complicated the process of interviewing neighbors or establishing a routine. The timeline established by detectives highlighted a significant gap. Elizabeth Short was last seen alive on January 9th, 1947, 6 days prior to the discovery on Norton Avenue. The reconstruction of her movements on that final confirmed day became the central focus of the initial inquiry. Witness statements and transport records placed Elizabeth Short in San Diego in early January. She had been staying with a woman named Dorothy French. On January 8th, Short left the French residence with a man named Robert Manley, a salesman she had been dating. Manley drove her to Los Angeles on the morning of January 9th. According to Manley's statement, which was later scrutinized during extensive interrogation, he dropped Short off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles at approximately 6:30 p.m. Short had allegedly told Manley she was meeting her sister, who was visiting from the East Coast. Manley waited in the lobby for a brief period before departing for his own family residence. Staff at the Biltmore Hotel confirmed seeing a woman matching Short's description in the lobby that evening. She was observed making telephone calls and waiting. However, no sister arrived. The claim of meeting a relative was later determined to be a fabrication. The last reliable sighting of Elizabeth Short occurred later that evening, January 9th. A witness reported seeing her exit the Biltmore and walk south down Olive Street. Some reports placed her at the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge shortly after, though these sightings were less definitive. from the night of January 9th until the morning of January 15th. The whereabouts of Elizabeth Short remain unaccounted for in the official file. This 7-day period is referred to in the investigation as the missing week. The medical examiner's report suggested that based on the state of rigor mortis and temperature, the loss of life had likely occurred approximately 10 to 15 hours before the discovery on the 15th. This left a significant window of time, several days, where Elizabeth Short was alive, but unobserved by any confirmed witness. Procedurally, the investigation was immediately hampered by the chaotic nature of the information intake. Following the publication of the story, the Los Angeles Police Department was inundated with tips. The sensationalism drove a frenzy of false confessions and erroneous sightings. Police logs recorded nearly 60 separate confessions from individuals claiming responsibility. Each confession required the allocation of detective hours to verify and inevitably disprove. Officers were dispatched to follow leads that claimed Short was seen in cities as far away as San Francisco or Chicago during the missing week, confusing the timeline and draining resources. Robert Manley was the first primary person of interest. He was subjected to a polygraph examination and multiple rounds of questioning. However, records indicate that Manley passed the examinations, and his alibi for the time of the death was verified by independent witnesses. He was eventually cleared as a suspect, leaving the timeline dark after January 9th. On January 24th, 9 days after the discovery, the investigation received its first significant piece of physical evidence from the unknown subject. A suspicious envelope arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. The envelope had been addressed with letters cut from newspaper headlines and pasted onto the paper. Inside, investigators found items belonging to Elizabeth Short: her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. Forensic analysis of the envelope and its contents revealed a deliberate counter-forensic measure. The sender had cleaned the items with gasoline. The pungent odor was still present when the package was opened by authorities. This action effectively destroyed any latent fingerprints that might have been transferred during the assembly of the package. The recovery of the address book provided a new list of potential leads. Mark Hansen, whose name was on the book, was brought in for questioning. Records indicate Short had previously stayed at a residence maintained by Hansen. Like Manley, Hansen was subjected to interrogation regarding his whereabouts between January 9th and January 15th. While Hansen was a person of interest due to his proximity to Short's social circle, investigators could not establish a direct link between him and the events of the missing week. The address book itself had pages missing, tearing from the binding, which suggested the sender had removed specific contacts before mailing it. On January 25th, another item surfaced. A handbag and one black suede shoe were discovered inside a trash bin in an alley several miles from the Norton Avenue location. The items were identified as belonging to Short by Robert Manley. Once again, the chain of custody had been compromised. The items had been handled by the sanitation workers who found them, and subsequently by reporters, before being turned over to police. The gasoline scent was present on these items as well, linking them to the sender of the packet. But the contamination rendered them forensically useless for fingerprinting. The forensic analysis of the subject provided detailed, yet disturbing, context regarding the days leading up to the discovery. The autopsy revealed ligature marks on the ankles, wrists, and neck, indicating that the individual had been restrained for a period of time prior to the end of life. The incision separating the torso was clean, avoiding bone damage by passing through the intervertebral disc between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. This reinforced the profile of an offender with anatomical knowledge. Furthermore, the stomach contents were analyzed and found to contain fecal matter. This detail indicated that the individual had consumed minimal food in the days leading up to the incident, and suggested either a reversal of digestion due to extreme trauma, or that the individual had been forced to consume the material. This specific detail was kept from the public for years, as it indicated to profilers that the motivation behind the incident was deeply pathological and personal, rather than a robbery or a random act of violence. The clinical assessment of the injuries, specifically the care taken in the post-mortem cleaning and posing, pointed toward an offender who felt a need to display their work. The subject had been washed with a coarse brush, and the hair had been recently washed. This attention to detail reinforced the theory that the individual had been kept at a primary location for a significant duration before being moved, a location that required running water, drainage, and privacy. Officers inspected storm drains, vacant houses, and laundry facilities within a several-mile radius of the disposal site. They requisitioned records from local dry cleaners, looking for clothing stained with biological material. They engaged in a review of the University of Southern California Medical School, located near the disposal site, requesting lists of students who had access to surgical labs or who had withdrawn from the program. However, the university administration resisted full transparency, citing student privacy, and no specific suspect was generated from this line of inquiry. By the spring of 1947, the investigation began to stall. The timeline of the missing week remained a void. Detectives verified that Short did not check into any local hotels under her own name. No bus drivers or taxi operators could recall transporting her after she left the Biltmore. The disconnect between the specific clinical nature of the injuries and the public spectacle of the discovery created a difficult atmosphere for the detectives. They were operating in a jurisdiction where leaks were common, and the pressure to solve the case escalated instantly. The grand jury convened in 1949 to review the accumulated evidence. The files presented detailed the exhaustive elimination of suspects, including medical professionals and known offenders in the area. However, the grand jury concluded that there was insufficient evidence to indict any single individual. The failure to secure the location on the morning of January 15th, the destruction of forensic traces on the mailed items via gasoline, and the overwhelming deluge of false information created a perfect storm of procedural deadlock. As the years progressed, the case transitioned from an active investigation to a study in cold case management. The physical evidence collected was sparse. The cement sack found at the scene was analyzed, but the results were inconclusive regarding its origin. The tire tracks were too degraded to provide a match. The investigation turned entirely on the analysis of Elizabeth Short's social circle and the individuals she interacted with during her time in California. Yet none could be definitively linked to the crime. The tangible records, the clean incision, the gasoline-soaked letters, the dry earth beneath the subject, painted a picture of a calculated, process-driven event. Yet the person who executed that process remained outside the grasp of the authorities. The file remained open, accumulating paper, but no resolution. The incident on Norton Avenue was merely the endpoint of a sequence of events that the Los Angeles Police Department was charged with reconstructing, starting from a cold trail and a compromised beginning. What transpired in the intervening 140 hours between the Biltmore Hotel and Norton Avenue remains a void that the investigation never filled.